Imagine a land at the crossroads of three continents, where faith, power, and ambition collide. A land that kings, knights, and emperors were willing to die for. That land was Palestine. But why did tens of thousands of men and women abandon their homes in Europe to march across deserts and seas for a holy war? Why did the call of a single pope ignite centuries of conflict that reshaped the Middle East and Europe alike? And what happened when Christian crusaders finally clashed with the Muslim defenders of Jerusalem? Was it faith, greed, or survival that truly drove the bloodshed? This is not just a story of battles and sieges. It is the story of betrayal and unity, of holy visions and brutal realities, of how the Crusades forever changed Palestine and the world. Stay with me, because as we peel back the layers of this history, you'll see that the Crusades were far more than just wars of religion. They were the wars that defined civilizations. The land before the Crusades. To truly understand the Crusades and why Palestine became the center of one of the bloodiest conflicts in medieval history, we must begin by looking at the region before the Crusaders ever set foot there. Palestine was not just a piece of land. It was the meeting point of civilizations, the heart of religious traditions, and the crossroads of empire. By the time the First Crusade began in 1096, Palestine already carried thousands of years of layered history, each civilization leaving its mark upon its soil. The sacred geography of Palestine. Palestine occupies a small strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Despite its modest size, it has always held immense significance. To Jews, it is the promised land described in the Hebrew Bible. To Christians, it is the place where Jesus Christ was born, crucified, and resurrected. To Muslims, it is the land of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, from where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven during the Isra and Miraj. Because of this spiritual weight, Palestine has never been an ordinary territory. Its soil has been bathed in faith, hope, and conflict. Kingdoms, empires, and tribes have fought relentlessly over it, not just for its geography, but for what it represents. By the 11th century, when European knights and peasants began marching toward it, Palestine was already a mosaic of religions, ethnicities, and cultures. Palestine under early Islamic rule. In the 7th century, Muslim armies swept out of Arabia and took control of Palestine from the Byzantine Empire. The conquest was surprisingly swift. In 637, Jerusalem surrendered peacefully to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who entered the city without bloodshed. Umar's respectful treatment of Christian and Jewish communities set the tone for how Muslims administered the city. Christians were allowed to keep their holy sites, and Jews, who had been banned from Jerusalem under Byzantine rule, were permitted to return. For centuries afterward, Palestine flourished under successive Islamic caliphates: the Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasid, and eventually the Fatimids of Egypt. The Umayyads, ruling from Damascus, built the magnificent Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in 691, a structure that still dominates Jerusalem's skyline today. Islamic rule brought integration into the broader trade networks of the Muslim world. Pilgrims from across the Islamic Empire traveled to Jerusalem, while merchants and scholars moved freely. Palestine was not an isolated frontier, but rather a vibrant and connected land within a vast civilization. The Byzantine-Muslim rivalry. However, Palestine was never far from conflict. For centuries, it was the front line between the Christian Byzantine Empire and successive Muslim states. Armies clashed repeatedly over control of the region. At times, the Byzantines pushed back and regained portions of the Holy Land. At other times, Muslim rulers reasserted dominance. This constant tug-of-war meant that by the late 11th century, when the Crusades began, Palestine was already accustomed to being contested ground. Its rulers had to balance religious communities, fend off external enemies, and maintain control over a city sacred to the three great Abrahamic faiths. Christian pilgrimage to Palestine before the Crusades. Long before the Crusaders came with their swords, Christian pilgrims had been journeying peacefully to the Holy Land. From the 4th century onward, after Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity, pilgrims from Europe traveled to Jerusalem to see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to contain the tomb of Christ. Despite periods of instability, these pilgrimages continued under Islamic rule. In most cases, Muslims tolerated Christian visitors, who paid special taxes and received protection. By the 11th century, thousands of pilgrims each year were visiting Palestine. While the journey was long and dangerous, the actual experience in Jerusalem was usually not marked by hostility. This fact is crucial. The Crusades were not born because Christians were barred from the Holy Land, but because of a complex blend of politics, religion, and fear. The Seljuk Turks and rising tensions. The balance began to shift in the mid-11th century with the rise of the Seljuk Turks. Originally nomadic warriors from Central Asia, the Seljuks converted to Islam and built a powerful empire. In 1071, they inflicted a crushing defeat on the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, seizing much of Anatolia. This was a disaster for the Byzantine Empire and a turning point in Christian-Muslim relations. Soon after, the Seljuks extended their influence into Palestine. Jerusalem fell under their control in 1073. Unlike the earlier rulers, the Seljuks were often less tolerant of Christian pilgrimage. Reports spread in Europe that pilgrims were being harassed, churches were being desecrated, and access to holy sites was being restricted. Although some of these accounts were exaggerated, they fueled anger in the Christian West. For many Europeans, the Holy Land seemed under threat. The sacred geography they revered was slipping into the hands of rulers they viewed as hostile. The Byzantine appeal for help. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire was reeling. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, desperate after the loss of Anatolia, reached out to the west. In 1095, he appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the Turks. Alexios likely envisioned receiving mercenaries to help reclaim his empire's territory. But the Pope saw a larger opportunity. Urban II transformed Alexios' call into a grand vision, a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. Europe on the eve of the Crusades. To understand why tens of thousands of Europeans responded to Urban's call, we must look at Europe itself in the late 11th century. Life was harsh, with frequent wars between feudal lords, famine, and disease. Knights, trained for combat, often turned their violence inward, fighting over petty disputes. The Catholic Church sought to channel this energy outward, redirecting warriors toward a cause deemed holy. At the same time, the Church promised spiritual rewards. Those who took the cross were assured of forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation. For peasants, knights, and nobles alike, this was a powerful incentive. The idea of reclaiming Jerusalem, the city of Christ, became a rallying cry that united rich and poor across Europe. The stage is set. By the end of the 11th century, Palestine stood at the center of a storm. Its sacred geography made it invaluable to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Its strategic position made it the prize of empires. Under Seljuk rule, tensions grew, pilgrim tales of hardship spread, and the Byzantine plea for help was transformed into a holy mission. In 1096, the first waves of Crusaders began their march toward the east. They were not coming simply as pilgrims, but as warriors. For the first time, the fate of Palestine would be decided not only by the empires of the East, but by armies from distant Europe. The land of peace and prophecy was about to become a battlefield. The First Crusade and the fall of Jerusalem. By the close of the 11th century, the call for a holy war had been sounded. Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095 had electrified Europe. He urged Christians to march eastward, to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, and to liberate the city of Jerusalem. His words ignited a fire in the hearts of nobles, knights, and even peasants. The Crusades had begun. The People's Crusade, zeal without preparation. The first response came not from the great lords of Europe, but from ordinary people. Inspired by wandering preachers like Peter the Hermit, tens of thousands of peasants, farmers, and minor knights set off in what became known as the People's Crusade. They lacked discipline, supplies, and proper leadership. instead of heading straight to Palestine. Many of these mobs vented their zeal against local Jewish communities in Europe, committing horrific massacres in cities along the Rhine. These attacks foreshadowed the brutal religious intolerance that would mark much of the crusading movement. When they finally reached the Byzantine Empire, the People's Crusade proved disastrous. Poorly armed and disorganized, they clashed with the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and were almost entirely annihilated. Their failure, however, did not end the crusading spirit. It only set the stage for the professional armies of Europe to arrive. The Prince's Crusade, the real campaign, begins. In 1096, the true First Crusade began, led by some of the most powerful nobles of Western Europe: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and others. These were seasoned warriors commanding thousands of knights and soldiers. Unlike the ragtag People's Crusade, this was a formidable military expedition. The Byzantines, wary of these heavily armed foreigners, offered them ships and guidance, but insisted they swear oaths to return captured lands to imperial control. With mixed feelings of cooperation and suspicion, the Crusaders crossed into Anatolia and began their bloody march toward Palestine. The Long March and the Siege of Antioch. The journey was grueling. Heat, hunger, and disease took their toll. But victories along the way kept morale alive. One of the most crucial moments came with the Siege of Antioch in 1097 to 1098. Antioch was a massive fortified city controlling the road to Palestine. The Crusaders besieged it for months, suffering starvation so severe that some resorted to eating horseflesh, and, according to some chronicles, even worse. When they finally breached the walls, they unleashed horrific slaughter upon its inhabitants. Yet almost immediately, they found themselves besieged in turn by a massive Muslim relief army. It seemed all was lost until the Crusaders, inspired by religious visions and desperation, launched a surprise attack and broke the enemy's lines. The fall of Antioch gave them a crucial foothold in the region and emboldened their faith that God was on their side. The March on Jerusalem. By 1099, the Crusaders turned their eyes toward their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. At this time, the city was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, who had taken it from the Seljuks. Ironically, the Crusaders were now fighting not the Turks, but another Muslim dynasty altogether. The march south was brutal. Supplies were scarce, and many Crusaders died along the way. But the survivors, driven by the dream of Jerusalem, pressed forward. In June 1099, they finally arrived before the city's massive stone walls. The Siege of Jerusalem. The Crusaders were horrified by what they faced. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, surrounded by walls and defended by determined Fatimid forces. The Crusaders had no siege engines, little food, and were outnumbered. But desperation and religious fervor pushed them on. They constructed siege towers and battering rams from whatever wood they could find. Chroniclers describe how priests led processions around the walls, barefoot, chanting prayers, while soldiers fasted in preparation for battle. To the Crusaders, this was not just war, it was the climax of a divine mission. On July 15, 1099, after weeks of fierce fighting, the Crusaders breached Jerusalem's defenses. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres of the medieval world, the sack of Jerusalem. The Crusaders stormed into the holy city and unleashed a wave of slaughter. Muslims and Jews alike were killed in the tens of thousands. Chroniclers from both sides describe blood flowing through the streets. The very sanctity of Jerusalem, sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths, became the scene of unspeakable violence. For the Crusaders, this was framed as a victory ordained by God. They had reclaimed the city of Christ, and their sins were washed away in blood. For Muslims and Jews, it was a catastrophe, remembered as a moment of betrayal and horror. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the leaders, refused the title of King of Jerusalem, declaring that no man should wear a crown in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. Instead, he styled himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A Crusader kingdom was established, stretching across Palestine and parts of Syria. The shock in the Muslim world. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 stunned the Muslim world. How could a relatively small group of foreign knights have captured one of Islam's holiest cities? Part of the answer lay in Muslim disunity. The Seljuks and Fatimids, rivals for control of a region, had been more focused on fighting each other than resisting the Crusaders. In the short term, this disunity allowed the Crusaders to carve out new states in the Levant. But in the longer term, the shock of Jerusalem's loss would eventually galvanize the Muslim world into a stronger, more unified response. The birth of the Crusader states. With Jerusalem under their control, the Crusaders established what became known as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Other Crusader states also formed, including the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These states were small, fragile enclaves of Western European rule in the midst of a vast Muslim world. They depended heavily on reinforcements and support from Europe, as well as uneasy truces with neighboring Muslim powers. For nearly a century, these Crusader states would survive, constantly balancing between aggression and defense, expansion and survival. But their very presence in Palestine ensured that the region would remain a battlefield for generations to come. Continuity toward the next chapter. The First Crusade ended in what seemed like triumph for the Christians of Europe. The Holy City was in their hands, and new Crusader states had been carved from the land of Palestine. But beneath the victory lay seeds of future conflict. The Muslim world, though divided, had been shaken into awareness. Jerusalem's fall would not be forgotten. The memory of massacre and occupation began to stir calls for unity and jihad. For now, however, the Crusaders rejoiced. Their long march across continents had ended in bloodshed and glory. Yet even as they prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they could not know that their conquest had set in motion centuries of war that would reshape Palestine forever. The Crusader states and Muslim counterattacks. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 marked the climax of the First Crusade, but it was only the beginning of a new struggle for dominance in the Holy Land. The Crusaders had carved out fragile enclaves in Palestine and Syria, but holding them would prove to be a challenge that required constant vigilance, diplomacy, and bloodshed. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. At the heart of the Crusader presence was the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon had taken the title of defender of the Holy Sepulchre, but after his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin I became the first official king of Jerusalem. Unlike Godfrey, Baldwin had no hesitation in wearing a crown. Under Baldwin and his successors, the kingdom expanded. Coastal cities like Acre, Jaffa, and Beirut were captured, strengthening Crusader control over trade routes and supply lines. Castles were built across the landscape to secure their rule. Fortresses such as Carrac, Croix de Chevaliers, and Belvoir Castle became symbols of Crusader military strength. Jerusalem itself was transformed. Churches and monasteries were rebuilt. Latin clergy replaced the Greek Orthodox hierarchy, and the city became the beating heart of the Crusader states. Yet, despite their dominance, the Crusaders were always a tiny minority ruling over a largely Muslim and Eastern Christian population. The other Crusader states. Beyond Jerusalem, 3 other Crusader states took root. To the north lay the Principality of Antioch, ruled by Bohemond and his descendants. Further east, the County of Edessa stretched precariously into Mesopotamia, vulnerable to attack from Muslim powers. Along the coast, the County of Tripoli emerged, providing a vital link between Jerusalem and Antioch. Together, these 4 states formed what historians call the Outremer, or lands beyond the sea. They were European colonies transplanted into the Middle East, sustained by constant reinforcements from Europe and occasional alliances with local powers. A culture of violence and survival. Life in the Crusader states was dominated by warfare. Muslim raids were frequent, and Crusader lords responded with expeditions of their own. The fragile balance of power meant that no ruler could ever let down his guard. At the same time, the Crusaders developed a degree of adaptation to their new home. Many began to wear lighter clothing suited to the climate, adopted local foods, and even employed Muslim and Eastern Christian administrators. Still, cultural divisions remained sharp. The Crusaders never fully integrated with the local population, and their rule was always viewed as foreign occupation. The rise of the military orders. One of the most unique developments of this period was the rise of the military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and later the Teutonic Knights. The Templars were founded to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Based at the site of the old Temple of Solomon, they combined monastic vows with military service. The Hospitallers, originally a charitable order caring for the sick, soon took on a military role as well. These orders became the backbone of Crusader defense. Their heavily fortified castles guarded key routes, and their disciplined knights were among the most formidable warriors in the region. In time, they grew wealthy and politically influential, rivaling even kings in power. Muslim responses, divisions, and resistance. For the Muslim world, the Crusader conquest of Palestine was a humiliation. But in the early years, disunity prevented an effective response. The Seljuks, divided into rival sultanates, were more concerned with internal struggles than with launching a united counterattack. The Fatimids in Egypt, who had briefly controlled Jerusalem before the Crusaders, also pursued their own agenda. Nevertheless, resistance did emerge. Local Muslim rulers frequently launched raids against Crusader territory. Skirmishes were constant, and Crusader settlements often lived in fear of sudden attacks. The first significant blow against the Crusaders came in 1144, when the Muslim general Imad ad-Din Zengi captured Edessa. This was the first Crusader state to fall, and its loss shocked Europe. The fall of Edessa would spark the call for the Second Crusade. The fragility of Crusader rule. Despite their victories, the Crusaders faced enormous challenges. Their states were small, thinly spread, and dependent on reinforcements from Europe. The local population was never fully loyal to them, and their enemies far outnumbered them. Even within their own ranks, divisions weakened their strength. Crusader lords often quarreled with each other, pursued personal ambitions, and sometimes made short-term alliances with Muslim rulers against rival Crusaders. This fragility meant that while the Crusaders could hold on to their states for decades, their position was never secure. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in Palestine was constantly under threat. Trade and diplomacy in the Outremer. Yet it would be wrong to imagine the Crusader states as existing in a state of endless war alone. Trade and diplomacy also played a crucial role. Italian merchant cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established strong commercial ties with the Crusader ports. They supplied ships, weapons, and goods in exchange for trading privileges. This made the Crusader states part of the larger Mediterranean economy. Diplomatically, Crusader rulers sometimes made truces with neighboring Muslim leaders. Survival often required pragmatism, and alliances shifted frequently. One year a Muslim emir might be an enemy. The next year he could be a valuable ally against a rival. The legacy of the First Crusade. The establishment of the Crusader states represented both triumph and fragility. To Europeans, they were proof that God had blessed their mission, a Christian foothold in the land of Christ. Pilgrims now flocked to Jerusalem under Crusader protection, fulfilling vows and seeking spiritual merit. But to the Muslims of the region, the Crusader presence was an open wound. The massacre of 1099 was not forgotten, and the foreign rule of Latin Christians was seen as an insult to Islam itself. The stage was being set for a clash of civilizations. The Crusaders had come as conquerors, but they would soon face leaders who were determined not only to resist, but to drive them out completely. Towards the Second Crusade, the fall of Edessa in 1144 exposed the fragility of the Crusader project. It was a warning that victories could be reversed, that the tide could shift. In Europe, the shock was immense, and a new wave of crusading fervor began to build. Kings and emperors would now take up the cross, promising to defend Christendom's hold on Palestine. For the Muslims, new leaders were rising, men like Zengi and later his son Nur ad-Din, who began to unite Muslim resistance. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem was no longer distant. It was becoming a rallying cry. Palestine, caught between fragile Crusader rule and a resurgent Muslim world, was entering a new phase of its history. The next great clash, the Second Crusade, was looming on the horizon. The Second Crusade and the rise of Nur ad-Din. The fall of Edessa in 1144 was the first major turning point in the history of the Crusader states. For nearly half a century, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and its allies had seemed secure, holding their castles and cities across Palestine and Syria. But the loss of Edessa, one of the earliest Crusader conquests, sent shockwaves through Christendom. It was proof that the Crusader project was fragile, and that Muslim resistance was growing stronger. The fall of Edessa. Edessa was the most vulnerable of the Crusader states. Far from the Mediterranean coast and surrounded by hostile powers, it had always been difficult to defend. Its ruler, Count Jocelyn II, was often at odds with his neighbors and lacked sufficient manpower to resist a determined attack. In 1144, the Muslim leader Imad ad-Din Zengi, governor of Mosul and Aleppo, laid siege to Edessa. Zengi was no ordinary commander. He was ambitious, ruthless, and determined to unite the Muslim world under his banner. After a short siege, Edessa fell. The city was sacked, its population massacred or enslaved. The loss stunned the Christian world. For Muslims, the victory was a sign that the tide was turning. For Christians in Europe, it was a call to arms, the call for a new crusade. News of Edessa's fall reached Europe and caused panic. The Pope at the time, Eugenius III, issued a call for a new crusade. This time, however, it would not be led merely by lords and nobles. It would be led by kings. The most prominent figures to take up the cross were King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Their decision marked a dramatic escalation. The Crusades were no longer just the ventures of minor nobles and adventurers, but royal campaigns backed by entire kingdoms. Preachers such as Bernard of Clairvaux toured Europe, inspiring thousands to join the cause. Bernard's fiery sermons declared that this was a war of God, a sacred mission to restore what had been lost. The Second Crusade marches east. The armies of Louis and Conrad set out in 1147, traveling separately across Europe and Anatolia. But the expedition was plagued with problems from the very beginning. The German army under Conrad suffered devastating losses to the Seljuks in Anatolia. The French fared little better, struggling with hunger, exhaustion, and ambushes along the way. By the time both armies limped into the Holy Land, their numbers were badly reduced. Strategic disunity. When the Second Crusaders finally arrived in Palestine, they faced a critical question. Where should they strike? Some argued for a direct attempt to retake Edessa, but the city had been razed and fortified by Zengi. It was nearly impossible to recapture. Instead, under the influence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's rulers, the Crusaders decided to attack Damascus, a wealthy and strategic city. This decision would prove disastrous. The Siege of Damascus. In 1148, the combined forces of the Crusaders laid siege to Damascus. At first, they had some success, advancing into the orchards surrounding the city. But internal divisions soon undermined their efforts. The leaders quarreled over strategy, and the local Christian allies of Damascus, who had often been enemies of Zengi, were alienated by the Crusaders' aggression. Within days, the siege collapsed. The Crusaders retreated in humiliation, their great campaign ending in failure. For the Muslims of the region, this was a turning point. The once mighty Crusaders had shown themselves vulnerable. For the Christians of Europe, it was a bitter disappointment. The Second Crusade had accomplished nothing and had even worsened the situation by alienating potential allies. The rise of Nur ad-Din. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was producing new leaders of remarkable ability. Zengi, the conqueror of Edessa, was assassinated in 1146. His son Nur ad-Din inherited Aleppo and later Damascus, becoming one of the most important figures in the struggle against the Crusaders. Nur ad-Din was not only a skilled military commander, but also a devout Muslim. He framed his wars against the Crusaders not just as battles for territory, but as part of a broader jihad to defend Islam. This religious dimension gave his campaigns a powerful unifying force. Under Nur ad-Din, the Muslim world began to move toward greater unity. He consolidated control over much of Syria, defeating rivals and strengthening his hold on power. With both Aleppo and Damascus under his authority, he became the dominant Muslim leader in the region. Crusader states under pressure. For the Crusader states, the rise of Nur ad-Din was alarming. No longer were they facing fragmented Muslim rulers competing against each other. They were now confronted by a leader who combined political skill with religious zeal. Nur ad-Din launched repeated raids against Crusader territory, capturing castles and harassing supply lines. He also supported Muslim scholars and jurists, promoting the idea that resistance against the Crusaders was a sacred duty. The balance of power was beginning to shift. While the Crusaders still held Jerusalem and the coastal cities, their position was increasingly precarious. Cultural and religious tensions. The failure of the Second Crusade also deepened mistrust between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, ruling in Constantinople, had been suspicious of the Western Knights, fearing they were as much a threat to his empire as to the Muslims. The Crusaders, in turn, accused the Byzantines of treachery and insufficient support. This widening rift between Eastern and Western Christendom weakened the Christian cause in the Holy Land. Instead of unity, there was division. The Muslim vision expands. Nur ad-Din, meanwhile, was preparing for the future. He understood that the real prize was not just defending Syria, but reclaiming Jerusalem itself. While he did not live to see it, his efforts laid the foundation for the next great Muslim leader, his general and eventual successor, Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin, a young commander of Kurdish origin, would rise under Nur ad-Din's patronage and eventually eclipse even his achievements. But before Saladin's rise, Nur ad-Din's steady pressure was already reshaping the conflict. The shifting tide. By the mid-12th century, the Crusader states were still standing, but their future looked increasingly uncertain. The Second Crusade had ended in disaster, showing that even kings could not guarantee success. The Muslims, under leaders like Nur ad-Din, were beginning to find unity and purpose. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem remained strong in appearance, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Its rulers quarreled, its knights relied on reinforcements from Europe, and its enemies were growing ever more determined. The struggle for Palestine was entering a new phase, one that would see the rise of Saladin, the recapture of Jerusalem, and the most famous clashes of the entire crusading era, the later Crusades and the shifting balance of power. The outcome of the Third Crusade left a mixed legacy. On one hand, the Crusaders had failed to reclaim Jerusalem, the heart of their mission. On the other, they had secured a tenuous presence along the Palestinian coastline, ensuring that the Crusader states, though weakened, did not entirely vanish. Yet the uneasy peace negotiated between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart would not last long. The death of these two towering figures, Saladin in 1193 and Richard in 1199, opened a new chapter in the long struggle for dominance in Palestine. The next century would see a cycle of renewed crusading fervor, bitter internal divisions, and unexpected alliances. Most notably, the crusading movement began to shift in focus, sometimes straying far from Palestine itself. The Fourth Crusade, for instance, famously never reached the Holy Land. Instead, it turned against fellow Christians, sacking Constantinople in 1204. This shocking episode not only deepened the divide between the Latin West and the Byzantine East, but it also weakened Christian unity at a time when Muslims in the region were consolidating under new dynasties. The Fourth Crusade, a crusade gone astray. The call for the Fourth Crusade came from Pope Innocent III in 1198, just a few years after Saladin's death. His vision was to renew the holy mission to liberate Jerusalem and reinforce Christian control over Palestine. However, the execution of this plan went awry almost from the start. Financial troubles plagued the Crusaders. Unable to pay Venetian merchants for the fleet that was supposed to transport them to the Levant, the Crusaders agreed to attack the Christian city of Zara in 1202 as partial payment. This action, condemned by the Pope, marked the first sign of how distorted the crusade had become. By 1204, the Crusaders, driven by financial desperation and opportunism, had turned their weapons against Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city was brutally sacked, its treasures looted, its churches desecrated, and its people massacred. Instead of strengthening the Christian front against Islam, the Fourth Crusade irreparably fractured Christendom, leaving the Byzantine Empire crippled and vulnerable. For Palestine, this was a disastrous diversion. Instead of reinforcing the Crusader states, the energy and resources of Western Europe were spent in civil wars within Christendom. The Muslims of the region, though experiencing their own internal disputes, were spared the massive invasion that might otherwise have struck in the early 13th century. The rise of Ayyubid successors. While the West was distracted, the Islamic world was adjusting to life after Saladin. His empire was divided among his sons and relatives, creating a patchwork of semi-independent rulers under the Ayyubid dynasty. This fragmentation weakened Muslim unity, but the Crusaders lacked the strength to take full advantage. Instead, the 13th century saw repeated clashes over key cities like Damietta in Egypt, which became the focus of several later crusades. Egypt was strategically vital. It was the breadbasket of the region and the seat of immense wealth. Whoever controlled Egypt had the resources to dominate Palestine. Both the Crusaders and the Ayyubids recognized this, leading to repeated campaigns in and around the Nile Delta. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, targeted Damietta in hopes of using it as a springboard to reclaim Jerusalem. The Fifth Crusade, the Egyptian Gambit. When the Fifth Crusade set sail, the plan was bold yet flawed. Led by European nobles, the Crusaders captured Damietta in 1219 after a long siege. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Christian fortunes in the East might revive. However, poor leadership and disunity doomed the effort. The Crusaders pushed further into Egypt, but were trapped by the flooding Nile and cut off from supply lines. In 1221, they were forced to surrender Damietta back to the Muslims in exchange for safe passage. The failure of the Fifth Crusade revealed a growing problem. The crusading movement had lost its coherence. While the early Crusades had been driven by religious zeal and relatively united leadership, by the 13th century, competing agendas, logistical challenges, and political rivalries often undermined their goals. Frederick II and the Sixth Crusade. Diplomacy instead of war. If the Fifth Crusade had failed militarily, the Sixth Crusade offered a surprising alternative path: negotiation. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated by the Pope at the time, nevertheless embarked on a crusade in 1228. Instead of fighting, Frederick engaged in diplomatic talks with Al-Kamil, the Ayyubid ruler of Egypt and nephew of Saladin. In 1229, the two leaders reached an extraordinary agreement. Through the Treaty of Jaffa, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were peacefully returned to Christian control, though the Muslims retained control of the Temple Mount and other key sites. For the first time, diplomacy, rather than bloodshed, had restored some measure of Christian presence in the Holy City. Frederick II crowned himself King of Jerusalem, though his authority was tenuous and contested. Still, his success highlighted the complexities of the period. Muslim rulers were sometimes willing to negotiate when it served their interests, especially when internal rivalries threatened their hold on power. The decline of the Crusader states. Yet this peace would not last. The fragile Christian foothold in Jerusalem lasted only about 15 years. In 1244, a new power entered the stage. The Khwarezmian Turks, displaced by the Mongol invasions in Central Asia, swept into the Levant. They sacked Jerusalem with unprecedented brutality, leaving the city in ruins and ensuring it would remain in Muslim hands permanently. The destruction of Jerusalem galvanized the West once more, leading to the Seventh Crusade led by King Louis IX of France. But once again, Egypt was the target, and once again, disaster awaited. In 1249, Louis captured Damietta, but soon became trapped in Egypt, much like his predecessors. Defeated at the Battle of Al-Mansurah in 1250, Louis was captured and ransomed, marking yet another humiliating failure for the Crusaders. The Mamluk ascendancy. Meanwhile, a dramatic change was occurring within the Muslim world. In Egypt, the Ayyubid dynasty was replaced by a new power, the Mamluks. Originally slave soldiers of Turkic and Circassian origin, the Mamluks seized power in 1250. Fierce warriors and shrewd politicians, the Mamluks would become the decisive force in the final battles over Palestine. Under leaders like Sultan Baybars, the Mamluks launched systematic campaigns to eradicate the Crusader presence. One by one, the coastal strongholds, Caesarea, Arsuf, and eventually Antioch, fell to their relentless assaults. The Crusader states, once formidable, were now reduced to a shrinking strip of land clinging to the Mediterranean shore, the shadow of the Mongols. At the same time, a far greater threat loomed over both Christians and Muslims, the Mongols. Sweeping westward from Asia, the Mongols conquered Persia and Iraq, destroying Baghdad in 1258 and ending the Abbasid Caliphate. For a moment, it seemed the Mongols might also sweep into Palestine. In 1260, they advanced into Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. Both Crusaders and Muslims feared annihilation, but it was the Mamluks who rose to the challenge. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluks dealt the Mongols their first major defeat, halting their advance and securing Muslim control of Palestine. This victory not only saved the region from Mongol conquest, but also elevated the Mamluks as the supreme power in the Islamic Near East. The turning tide, Saladin's jihad, and the fall of Jerusalem. By the mid-1180s, the balance of power in the Holy Land had begun to shift dramatically. After decades of internal feuds and fragile truces, the Muslim world finally found in one man the leader it had long been waiting for, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known in the West as Saladin. His rise marked a turning point not only in the struggle for Palestine, but in the entire story of the Crusades. Saladin's rise to power. Saladin was born in 1137 in Tikrit, into a Kurdish family. His early years were spent under the tutelage of his uncle Shirkuh, a general in the service of the Zengid ruler Nur al-Din. At first, Saladin showed little interest in warfare, preferring study and theology. But circumstance thrust him into command. After Shirkuh's campaigns in Egypt and subsequent death, Saladin, almost unexpectedly, was appointed vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. What followed was nothing short of remarkable. Saladin consolidated power, outmaneuvered rivals, and abolished the declining Shurayh Fatimid dynasty, bringing Egypt under the Sunni Abbasid banner. By 1174, after Nur al-Din's death, Saladin inherited the mantle of leadership across both Egypt and Syria, effectively uniting the fractured Muslim world under his rule. This unity gave him an enormous advantage over the Crusader states, which by contrast were plagued by bitter infighting, succession crises, and political rivalries. A different kind of leader. Unlike many medieval rulers, Saladin was guided by a vision larger than personal ambition. He declared jihad not merely as a military campaign, but as a spiritual duty to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. Yet, his style was tempered by diplomacy and pragmatism. He negotiated truces when convenient, avoided reckless wars, and slowly but surely tightened his grip around the Crusader states. Meanwhile, in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, internal strife left the kingdom vulnerable. After King Amalric's death, the crown passed to his son Baldwin IV, the so-called Leper King. Though tragically afflicted by disease, Baldwin was a brilliant tactician and managed to keep Saladin at bay for years. But his illness made the question of succession urgent and divisive. Factions within the kingdom, led by figures such as Raymond of Tripoli, Guy of Lusignan, and the Templars, quarreled incessantly, undermining unity at a critical moment. The road to Hattin. By the mid-1180s, tensions escalated. A major trigger came from the reckless actions of Raynald of Chatillon, a notorious Crusader lord. Despite truces with Saladin, Raynald repeatedly raided Muslim caravans and even threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. His provocations enraged Saladin, who vowed to personally kill Raynald. The breaking point arrived in 1187. Saladin assembled a massive coalition army, drawing forces from across his dominions. His strategy was brilliant. Rather than attacking piecemeal, he sought a decisive showdown. The Crusader leadership, meanwhile, was deeply divided. Guy of Lusignan, who had married into the throne, faced resistance from other nobles, but ultimately led the kingdom into battle. The two armies met at the Battle of Hattin near Tiberias in July 1187. The Battle of Hattin, a catastrophe for the Crusaders. Hattin was the defining clash of the era. Saladin lured the Crusader army into arid terrain, far from water sources, under the blistering summer sun. His forces encircled the Christians, cutting them off from Lake Tiberias. As thirst and exhaustion took their toll, the Crusader ranks collapsed. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusaders, was captured. King Guy was taken prisoner, and Saladin personally executed Reynaud of Chatillon, fulfilling his vow. The defeat at Hattin was catastrophic. Virtually, the entire fighting force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was annihilated in a single day. The fall of Jerusalem. With the Crusader army destroyed, Saladin marched swiftly through Palestine. One city after another fell with little resistance. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, and Ascalon surrendered. By October 1187, only Jerusalem remained. The city, defended by Balian of Ibelin, was poorly garrisoned but determined to resist. Saladin, however, conducted the siege with both ferocity and restraint. After days of fighting, Balian negotiated terms. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. Here, Saladin distinguished himself from earlier Crusader conquerors. Unlike the bloody massacre of 1099, Saladin allowed ransoms to be paid for the Christian population. Many were released, while those who could not afford freedom were enslaved but spared slaughter. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open to Christian pilgrims, though the city was once again under Muslim control. The capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news. Across Christendom, cries rang out for a new crusade, the most ambitious yet. The call for the Third Crusade. The fall of Jerusalem galvanized Europe like no event since the First Crusade. Pope Gregory VIII issued a bull, calling on the kings of Christendom to take up the cross once again. Unlike earlier campaigns, which had been led primarily by regional nobles, this crusade would be spearheaded by Europe's greatest monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. For the first time, the Crusades had truly become a pan-European effort, driven not just by piety, but by royal prestige and geopolitical rivalry. Yet, even as Europe mobilized, Saladin was at the height of his power. He controlled Egypt, Syria, and Jerusalem, and his reputation as a just yet formidable ruler earned him admiration not only among Muslims, but even grudging respect from his Christian foes. Still, Saladin knew the war was far from over. The Crusaders might have been defeated at Hattin, but their resilience and their ability to summon new armies from Europe remained a looming threat. The stage was now set for one of the most famous clashes of the entire medieval world, the Third Crusade, where Richard the Lionheart and Saladin would face each other in a legendary struggle for control of Palestine. The waning power of the Crusaders, from Third Crusade to Fall of Acre. By the close of the Third Crusade, the Crusader states were shadows of their former selves. The Treaty of Jaffa had secured temporary peace and granted Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. But the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was slipping away. The Crusaders had survived Saladin's storm, but their foothold in Palestine was increasingly fragile, caught between the rising tide of Muslim unity and the internal fractures of the Latin West. The aftermath of the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart's departure in 1192 left the Crusaders without a strong, unifying leader. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer centered in Jerusalem itself, but along the coastal cities such as Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre. These cities became fortified hubs of trade, diplomacy, and survival. Yet, without Jerusalem, the Crusader identity suffered a crisis. Their presence in the East was beginning to look more like that of maritime colonies than the Holy Kingdom they had once envisioned. Saladin's death in 1193 seemed to present a window of opportunity. His empire fragmented among his heirs, with rivalries between the Ayyubid princes in Egypt, Damascus, and Aleppo. The Crusaders hoped to exploit these divisions, but constant disputes between European rulers meant that no united crusading force arrived to capitalize on the situation. The Fourth Crusade and its diversion. When a new crusade was called at the turn of the 13th century, the Crusaders once again looked eastward. However, what followed was one of the most infamous diversions in history. Instead of marching to Palestine, the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, were manipulated into attacking Christian cities, first Zara on the Adriatic, and then Constantinople itself. In 1204, they stormed and looted the Byzantine capital, establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople. For Palestine, this was disastrous. Instead of reinforcements, the Crusader states received nothing. Worse, the Byzantine Empire, once a vital ally and buffer, was crippled. The Muslim rulers of Syria and Egypt now faced a divided Christian world, more hostile to itself than to them. The Fifth and Sixth Crusades, brief revival. In 1217, the Fifth Crusade set out with the idea of striking at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power under the Ayyubids. The Crusaders, allied with the Kingdom of Jerusalem and supported by the papacy, besieged Damietta in the Nile Delta. After a long struggle, they captured the city in 1219, but their success was short-lived. When they marched deeper into Egypt, the Nile's flooding and determined Ayyubid resistance forced their surrender. The Crusaders were compelled to give up Damietta, and the expedition ended in failure. The Sixth Crusade, however, brought a surprising twist. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, through diplomacy rather than war, negotiated with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt. In 1229, Frederick secured a treaty granting Christians control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth for 10 years. This unusual victory, without battle, temporarily restored Jerusalem to Christian hands. But it was a fragile arrangement. Muslims still controlled the Temple Mount and the surrounding defenses, and many in the Latin East viewed Frederick's truce with suspicion. Muslim resurgence, the rise of the Mamluks. By the mid-13th century, the Ayyubid dynasty gave way to a new power in Egypt, the Mamluks. Originally slave soldiers, the Mamluks overthrew their masters and established their own rule in Cairo. Fierce warriors and skilled commanders, they inherited both the military traditions of the Ayyubids and a burning zeal to expel the Crusaders. The Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, led by King Louis IX of France, once again targeted Egypt. Louis captured Damietta, but was trapped at Mansoura, where his army was crushed. Louis himself was captured and released only after paying a heavy ransom. The Mamluks had proven themselves a formidable enemy, and their rise marked a new chapter in the struggle for Palestine. The Mongol threat and brief alliances. As the Crusaders dwindled, a new force appeared on the horizon, the Mongols. Sweeping across Asia in the mid-13th century, they destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and advanced into Syria. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Mongols might ally with the Crusaders against the Muslims. Indeed, when the Mongols captured cities like Aleppo and Damascus in 1260, some Crusaders welcomed them. But this alliance never materialized fully. The Mamluks decisively defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a turning point not only for the Crusades, but for the entire Middle East. This victory cemented the Mamluks as defenders of Islam and rulers of the Muslim world. From this moment, they turned their full attention to eliminating the Crusader states. Legacy of the later Crusades. The Crusades after the Third became less about reclaiming Palestine and more about wider struggles, political power in Europe, rivalries with Byzantium, and wars against Muslims in Spain and North Africa. Yet Palestine remained the symbolic heart of crusading fervor. Every campaign, no matter how far it strayed, carried with it the memory of Jerusalem and the hope, never fulfilled, that it might once again be Christian. The later Crusades, decline, and legacy in Palestine. The story of the Crusades in Palestine does not end with the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. In many ways, that event marked a turning point, a sobering reality check for Europe, but also a beginning of new strategies, alliances, and ambitions. For the next century and beyond, waves of crusading armies continued to surge toward Palestine, yet the tide of history was shifting. The Holy Land would remain contested, but never again would the Crusaders achieve the kind of dominance they once briefly enjoyed. The Third Crusade and the shadow of Saladin. The Third Crusade, launched in response to Saladin's victory, brought some of the most famous monarchs of medieval Europe to Palestine. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick's sudden death during the march weakened the expedition, but Richard's campaigns in the Levant became legendary. The conflict between Richard and Saladin was both brutal and oddly chivalric. They clashed in a series of battles, most notably at Arsuf in 1191, where Richard's disciplined forces managed to defeat Saladin's army. Yet despite military brilliance, Richard could not achieve the ultimate goal of retaking Jerusalem. Saladin's hold on the city remained strong, bolstered by his logistical foresight and the loyalty he inspired. The crusade ended in 1192 with a truce. Jerusalem would stay under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be granted access to holy sites. This compromise, while unsatisfying to zealots on both sides, revealed the growing recognition that the conflict could not be settled by force alone. The Fourth Crusade and a shift away from Palestine. By the early 13th century, the crusading spirit in Europe had begun to shift in strange directions. The Fourth Crusade, intended to strike at Egypt as a way of reclaiming Palestine, was diverted to Constantinople. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, Crusaders ended up sacking the great Byzantine capital in 1204. This shocking act deepened the schism between Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and it demonstrated how crusading fervor could be hijacked for political and economic gain. For Palestine, this was both a relief and a danger. While it meant fewer immediate invasions, it also meant that the Holy Land was no longer the exclusive focus of crusading energies. Still, smaller crusades followed, with sporadic campaigns to recover lost ground. The Fifth and Sixth Crusades, shifting tactics. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, targeted Egypt again, this time focusing on the Nile Delta city of Damietta. The idea was to weaken the Ayyubid dynasty there, and then press on to Jerusalem. While initially successful in capturing Damietta, the Crusaders were eventually trapped and forced to surrender, giving up all gains. The Sixth Crusade, however, took a very different approach. In 1229, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire managed to negotiate with Al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew. Without a major battle, Jerusalem was returned to Crusader control through diplomacy. For a brief period, Christians re-entered the Holy City peacefully, a remarkable outcome compared to the bloodshed of earlier campaigns. Yet this peace was fragile, and within a few years, Muslim forces retook the city once again. The later Crusades and the fall of Acre. Throughout the mid to late 13th century, crusading armies dwindled in power and unity. The Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, ended in disaster in Egypt. The Eighth Crusade, also under Louis IX, targeted Tunis rather than Palestine, showing how far crusading aims had strayed from their original vision. Meanwhile, the Crusader states in Palestine shrank to a few coastal strongholds, chief among them Acre. This once bustling port became the lifeline of Christian presence in the Holy Land. But in 1291, after a determined siege by the Mamluks of Egypt, Acre fell. The last Crusader stronghold in Palestine was obliterated. With it, 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant came to an end. The Muslim world after the Crusades. For the Muslim world, the end of the Crusades brought both relief and new challenges. Saladin had created a powerful legacy of unity, but after his death, his successors fractured, and it was only the Mamluks who ultimately secured Palestine against European attacks. By the late 13th century, Palestine was firmly under Muslim control, first under the Ayyubids, then the Mamluks, and later the Ottomans. Yet the Crusades left scars. The memory of invasion, massacre, and foreign domination lingered in Islamic consciousness for centuries. At the same time, the experience of resisting and ultimately triumphing against such formidable foes became a source of pride and a unifying narrative. Figures like Saladin entered legend not only in the Islamic world, but also in the West, admired even by enemies for their statesmanship and chivalry. The European perspective and the idea of the crusade. For Europe, the Crusades were a mixture of glory and humiliation. While early victories had inspired triumphalism, the later failures revealed the limits of European power. Still, the Crusades reshaped Europe itself. Nobles who marched to the east often never returned, redistributing land and wealth at home. Trade routes with the Levant expanded dramatically, enriching Italian cities like Venice and Genoa. Intellectual and cultural exchanges also accelerated. Through Palestine, Europeans encountered advanced medical knowledge, mathematics, and classical works preserved by Muslim scholars. Yet the religious zeal that drove the Crusades also hardened divisions. Relations with the Byzantine Empire were destroyed, Jewish communities in Europe suffered persecution, and the notion of holy war became deeply ingrained in Western political thought. The legacy in Palestine. For Palestine itself, the Crusades were both destructive and transformative. Entire cities were devastated by repeated battles, populations displaced, and holy sites desecrated or rebuilt depending on who held power. Yet Palestine also remained a crossroads, a place where cultures met, clashed, and exchanged. Despite the violence, the Crusades ensured that Palestine's significance as both a sacred and strategic land would never fade from global consciousness. The Crusades cemented Jerusalem's symbolic power in the imagination of Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. For Christians, it remained the lost holy city that inspired centuries of longing. For Muslims, it became the sacred trust defended successfully against foreign invaders. For Jews, who suffered at the hands of Crusaders in Europe and faced marginalization in the Holy Land, the period highlighted both their vulnerability and their enduring connection to the land. The enduring impact. By the close of the Crusader era, Palestine was once again firmly under Muslim rule. But the centuries of conflict had left behind a legacy that still resonates. The Crusades transformed not just Palestine, but the wider Mediterranean world, shaping identities, borders, and religious attitudes. They were a struggle not only for land, but for meaning, for which faith would define the sacred heart of the world. In the centuries that followed, European powers would continue to dream of reclaiming the Holy Land. But the age of the Crusades was over. Palestine would pass under the long stewardship of the Mamluks and later the Ottomans, carrying forward the memory of Crusaders' castles, battles, and pilgrimages as echoes of a turbulent past. And so, the Crusades came and went, but Palestine remained scarred, transformed, and forever at the heart of world history. The Holy Land saw kingdoms rise and fall, cities rebuilt and destroyed, and generations shaped by wars fought in the name of faith. Yet behind the banners of religion, the Crusades revealed deeper forces: power, politics, and survival. For Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the memory of these wars still echoes, shaping identities and struggles even centuries later. The Crusades did not end with the fall of Jerusalem, nor with the retreat of the last Crusader stronghold. Their legacy continued to ripple through Europe and the Middle East, redefining cultures, empires, and the very idea of holy war. So, as we close this chapter, one question remains: were the Crusades truly about God, or were they about man? History may never give us a single answer, but their impact still lives on in the stones of Jerusalem, in the faith of billions, and in the very world we live in today.